I was dragged kicking and screaming into faith. I think that actually is what did it, right? Because
Mm,
it was my intention merely to understand. But
mm.
then when I started doing that, became really interesting.
Now, you formally describe yourself as a skeptic, a non-believer, but you are not an enemy of faith. Maybe tell us a little bit of the kind of non-believer you were. And I'm also really curious what you thought of the new atheist movement.
Described myself as an agnostic, so I
Mm,
didn't take a position for or against. Um, a lot of atheists today simply say if you lack a belief in God, then you're an atheist. Well, I lacked a belief in God, but I didn't call myself an atheist. I called
uh-huh.
myself an agnostic. I found the uh, new atheist representatives, with a possible exception of Daniel Dennett, who's sort of a special case, um, obnoxious and unreasonable,
Hmm.
in the sense of being closed to actual reasoning. They tended to be, again, just in my experience, ignorant of the Bible. Like, I knew more of the Bible, and I didn't know that much
Hmm.
about the Bible at the time. Um, and I knew more than they did. Um, and and even, people like Sam Harris, who portrays himself as a philosopher, he clearly doesn't know very much philosophy.
Hmm.
I always thought that, and I actually picked up some books. The God Delusion. Um, I got this actually in 2020, I think, or maybe it was
Hmm.
2021, after my conversion, because I thought, okay, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to try to see what, like, serious arguments somebody like Richard Dawkins will make. They're not serious arguments at all. you
Hmm.
know it's exactly as I had experienced before. They're lightweight. They don't show an awareness of the intricacies on either side.
What
Mhm.
shifted where you had that mindset and you're like, I'm all in to understand this?
I'm not sure I really ever really understood why I got so obsessed with
Hmm.
it. Maybe I was led by the Holy Spirit. I mean, at first, I was just going to read it for bedtime reading, and I did that for maybe 3 or 4 days. But then, like, it was so fascinating.
Hmm.
I actually read parts, the same part that I read, to my son a few years before, and had
Hmm.
made no impression of this sort at all. But this time I was doing something different, because I said, okay, look, I'm not just like reading this to my son so he's familiar with, like, the verbiage and the concepts and the characters and so forth. No, I actually want to understand it on its own terms. I actually wanted
Hmm.
to understand what the Christians believe. All right. And this meant, and this is something I would insist on strongly now, that if you're going to study the Bible and understand it, you have to understand it the way that the people who believe it understand it,
Yep.
not the way that modern scholars understand it, because they're wrong. They don't take it the way the ancient Hebrews
Hmm.
did, the ancient Christians did, or modern Christians do. So I actually used gotquestions.org, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great.
It's a it's a good website. It's
Hmm.
got, I mean, it's very, reformed, but it's got a lot of solid stuff in it, a lot of good answers, and my hat is off to those guys. I think that actually is what did it, right? Because
Hmm.
it was my intention merely to understand. But
Hmm.
then when I started doing that, became really interesting.
Hmm.
And the thing that was amazing to me, the more I actually looked up answers to my questions, which initially I didn't necessarily believe. I was just acquainting myself with the answers. Um, but what I was amazed to discover is that the 2,000-year-old history of theology had been asking and answering these questions, and their answers, at least given sort of modern formulations that were palatable to me, they actually made sense.
Mm.
They weren't incoherent. And I'll tell you this other thing. This is going a little bit beyond this point in the narrative, but I actually started writing a commentary of Genesis. It ended up being over 500 pages long.
Oh my goodness.
It is basically study notes. It's questions and answers. And I asked every question that I could think of about the book of Genesis as I went through it. And some days I would spend like over an hour writing out answers. And I was able to answer every single one. If you don't really carefully analyze the Bible, you're not going to learn all the things that there is. And the thing, to get back to the point, the thing that I discovered is that when you ask the hard questions and you really try to get to faithful answers, the answers of the sort that the people who believed the text had in mind, the original recipients, the smartest of them, what they understood, what they had in mind, then you will discover all sorts of things that you can't see in the text. And this is the only proper way to understand the Bible, and it's the way to make the Bible the most persuasive.
I love hearing you say this more than I can describe, Larry, because I've heard from so many people growing up that ask questions like you did. I was a question asker, and my dad was like, let's talk about it. Tell me your questions, was not threatened by doubts. So many people afraid to ask questions turned away and understandably don't feel welcome in the church. And yet I tell my students the same thing. I'm like, if you actually go to the text and you look for answers, the vast majority of time, it might take some research and thought, you can find them. And you see this, one of my favorite commentaries in the Old Testament is by Dennis Prager, who's a Jew. And he starts by saying we should ask questions of the text. And when we do and we probe, because Israel means wrestle with God, it's amazing the responses that we can find. So it seems like your story is kind of coming full circle from somebody, not kicked out of the church, but not welcomed because of questions, to finally saying, wait a minute, I'm a question asker. I'm a philosopher. There's a place for me, a seat at the table, so to speak. And if I use my mind, I actually find that this is true. I love that. I also found this super interesting. You described not having a mind-blowing conversion to faith. What was it like when you all of a sudden just thought, okay, I'm a believer? And was there a sense where you had a realization of the weight of your sin as a part of that conversion?
Well, I sort of, I felt kind of, this is a little too dramatic, but it gets at the idea. I was dragged kicking and screaming into faith.
Finally surrender our egos and recognize that the questions that we're asking may have already been asked for, and they may have already been thoroughly answered before. It's when Christ does his best work, isn't it? So Larry's journey is one of 53 now former atheists who converted to Christianity. Of course, with that former atheist, we are using the atheist's own wordplay. They considered an atheist to be anyone who does not have an active belief in God, or someone who says, I don't know, to the question of whether or not there is a God, or no to the proposition altogether. So whenever you do use their definition, we now have 53 converts from atheism to Christianity on this channel. It is pretty exciting. The cumulative case for Christ, the cumulative case for God. How could one deny it? Perhaps only if one wants to keep visiting those websites. You know what I mean? Christ is king. Every knee will bow. Absolutely.